Thanks very much. As you can see, I'm a local. My accent's very much a Texan accent. I've been, just down the road. Although I work in Dallas at the moment, most of my work, 70% of my work is for the system. So I'm involved in what's called stress testing. You're looking at the largest 40 banks in the US, and you're seeing if a severely adverse scenario came on, something like 2007, 2010. If that happened again, would the banks have enough capital? So the areas I'm working there, I lead a team, and we take every loan over $1 million that's a commercial real estate or a corporate loan, C&I loan. And we stress that and look at the potential losses. And obviously one of the things that's on a lot of people's minds at the moment is, have companies got too much debt? Is there too much leverage lending out there? Are a lot of the loans, corporate loans, are they covenant light? So lending standards have loosened. There's concern about syndicated loans, all of those types of areas, which I'm not sure whether that impacts on your work or not, but one of the big concerns at the moment for regulators is this amount of corporate debt out there and whether banks are loosening their standards and whether we should be worried about it or not. Anyway, with my other hat, I do research and I work on the US economy. On occasion, I've gone to federal open markets committees where they set interest rates. Because of that, there's some questions you can ask me and I can give you answers to them. There's some other questions I can't answer because I'm involved in policy making and there's a requirement that I don't answer certain questions. But I'm trying to answer as many questions as I possibly can. And the views, we always have to say this, these are my views, they're not the Federal Reserve views, they're not the views of the president of the Dallas Fed or, Powell, who's the chairman of the FOMC, or anyone else's. They're purely my views. Okay, where's the economy now? Okay. This is just an overview. We know we did tax cuts and the economy was booming last year. So it grew around, the latest numbers came out yesterday. The first estimate for how much the economy grew last year was almost 3%. Now you might think, is that high or low? The normal growth rate for the economy, we think, going forward is about 1.8%. So there's a sugar rush last year. The economy was doing really well. Do we expect it to continue? No, we expect it to go back closer to trend over time. And you can see last year was particularly good because it grew 1.6%. I should have said 2016, 2.2% in 2017, and then 2.9%. So it went up from 1.5% to 2.25% to 3% last year, and now it's coming back down. So the growth rate peaked and it's coming down. Okay, should we be worried about a recession? No, we're saying the economy is still going to grow at quite a reasonable pace, but it's slower than last year. The growth rate is moderating. It's not a recession, as far as we can tell. So we're talking about solid growth at a more moderate rate. And then in 2020, reverting to trend, which is about 1.8%. And so these are average numbers. When I'm reporting numbers, I normally give what I call consensus numbers because the average forecast is better than any individual's forecast. Okay, you won't be right. Every forecast will be proved wrong in a lot of cases. Forecasting's a risky business, but this is what people are saying on average. So these are your best guess about what will happen to the economy in 2019 and 2020. In terms of the labor market, low unemployment, so we've very low unemployment at the moment. We expect that to continue. Real wage increases, they're increasing around 3%. Our wages are increasing around 3%. Inflation's about 2%, so in real terms, they're increasing 1 to 1.25%. In real terms, when you take away the effect of inflation. Okay, and inflation we think will be around 2%. And as you probably know, the Fed has, we say we're pausing. We were increasing interest rates up until now. Up until December, we said that over the next 2 years, we expect interest rates to increase gradually because of our mandate to control inflation and to, keep the economy growing at a steady rate. And we're getting close to our targets, so interest rates were low. We said we're going to raise interest rates to bring them back to a more normal level. At the December meeting, we said over the next year, we expect to see gradual increase in interest rates, and the market anticipated that there'd be 2 interest rate increases this year in 2019. Well, in January, there's a little bit of a turnaround. We said we're pausing because of the state of the economy and market turmoil. We're pausing in our increase in interest rates.
Question.
Yeah.
You just said because of market turmoil.
There's a couple of factors.
But you said market turmoil.
Yeah.
So if we say the VIX is giving you input as to how you change rates, when did that philosophy change?
It hasn't changed. We've always been concerned about the prospects for growth and financial stability. So we've always taken signals from the market.
Thank you.
But that wouldn't be the major factor. The stated reasons for not increasing rates so much were, one, there's a lot of uncertainty about there. People were concerned about the global economy and concerned about growth in China, growth in Europe, and so on. So there's a lot of factors going on. We said we've lots of time. If we want to raise rates, we've lots of time. So let's just pause for the moment and see what happens. And then if needs be, we can raise rates again. But on the whole, the market has interpreted the pause as a stop. And that is not the message we were trying to convey. So the market has a slightly different view about where rates are going than necessarily we might have. The market is interpreting that there'll be no rate, at most 1 rate increase this year, and most likely no rate increase this year. Yeah.
Before we leave this slide, I'm surprised to see 2.9% growth, because it seemed like the monthly and quarterly reports we get from media, 3.5, almost 4, consistently through the year.
That
wasn't correct?
They've generally come down through the year. Then you did partial government shutdown towards the end of December and January. So if you look at it on a quarterly basis, last quarter wasn't quite as strong as some of the other quarters. So it's varied a little bit over time. And then a lot of the hard numbers, they come out with a lag. So you're hearing about something that happened 3 months ago, or you're hearing a survey, and when the economy is beginning to slow down, you find that the bits of evidence you get can be very mixed. Some of the evidence is going up, some of it's going down. And newspapers write, and journalists, they write the stories. And it's always best to emphasize in terms of the economy, shock, horror, the latest retail sales number is really bad. Even though that's an advanced number, these numbers get revised repeatedly. We never judge where the economy is by the latest single number, because a lot of this data is very subject to revision. In the case of retail sales, it can be revised 8 times. Every single month, they go back and revise the previous month's numbers. So you never really put too much weight on one number. But journalists are selling a story. So they will tell you the most, exciting story out there. because they don't have to make a decision based on that one number. They're just selling a story.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
You had mentioned that the target was a normal interest rate.
Yeah.
I'm just curious, what would that metric be, sir?
Well,
Approximately.
around now, we think it's
What
around.
was your forecast?
There's a huge dispute about that, but there's uncertainty about it. We think it's close to 3% for the Fed funds rate. There's one interest rate we control. It's called the Fed funds rate. It's not an interest rate you can get in a loan. It's an interest rate that the banks, when they deal with us, will get that rate. But every other rate is sort of priced off that. So we think we manage short-term interest rates, this Fed funds rate. That affects 1 month rates, it affects 3 months rates, it affects 1 year rates. 1 year feeds into 10-year rates, and what do 10-year rates affect? Corporate bonds, and they affect 30-year fixed rate mortgages. Normally your 30-year fixed rate mortgage is a markup on the 10-year treasury rate. So the way we affect interest rates, we affect short-term interest rates, but it feeds through into these longer-term interest rates as well. These are the latest numbers. These were only published yesterday. You were talking about a mixture of news during the year. So you can see Q1, the growth rate was around 2%. Q2, it was 4%. So second quarter was great. It came down in Q3, it came down in Q4. So that's why you see this variation over the year. The growth rate wasn't uniform. A lot of the tax breaks and so on, they came in around this period. So this is the sugar rush. And then we're coming off the sugar rush. Okay. We have an idea of what the potential of the economy is. The economy is always growing. The potential out there, if everyone had a job and all the machinery was fully utilized and so on. So the orange line is what we think potential was, and the blue line is where we think we were. So what happened? The Great Recession came along, and all these resources were underutilized. All these people were unemployed. Machinery was working at low capacity and so on. And gradually, we had a very slow recovery from the Great Recession. So that blue line is only slowly getting back to potential, and now we're above potential. We think the economy is operating hot. That's why the unemployment rate is so low. And these are, I don't know whether you've come across these are surveys. They call them purchasing manager surveys. They survey executives in large companies and ask them where they think their business is going, how they feel about it, what the prospects are. And the number we give here is sort of the difference between the numbers who say things are good and the numbers who say things are bad. The average level is 50. So above the 50 line, you're saying the economy is expanding. Below the 50 line, the economy is contracting. And you can see during the Great Recession, which we shaded, this is the Great Recession period, 2007 to the end of 2009. All of these indices were very negative, which makes sense. The economy was in a bad place, so these ISM indices for manufacturing and non-manufacturing were way down here. And gradually they've recovered. You can see from month to month, they're very variable. That's part of the news that's reported all the time. These are surveys that change a bit. We don't put too much weight on any single survey. It's the general direction. Recently, these have been in very positive territory, and then they've turned down a little bit. So some people will read this as saying the economy is going into recession. Reread this as saying the economy's growth is moderating. growth isn't going to be 3% this year. It's going to be less than 3% this year. We're still in positive territory. So it's talking about the growth rate being fairly robust, but not as strong as last year. These indices are pretty good. They've, you know, how far ahead do they tell you about the economy? They tell you about the economy 6 months ahead. So these are useful short-term indicators that come in, and they're telling you, they come in on a monthly basis, they're fairly up to date. We can have some readings very shortly, and they're telling you what the likely state of the economy is for the next 6 months. So these are nice. People were concerned, the manufacturing was in blue. People were concerned when it dropped here, but it sort of recovered a little bit. Overall, we know the economy's not growing as fast, and they're just consistent with what we see.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Would that be consistent with some of the things that I've been hearing from the realtors that I work with, telling me that inventories are on the rise, buyer prices are coming down, and they're starting to see some short sales and foreclosures?
In the housing market, it very much varies from place to place. The housing market is slowing down, but what's happened recently? Mortgage rates have come down. So the house prices have been growing fairly robustly. So housing became a little bit more unaffordable. And there was mortgage rates were beginning to rise. Now in the past quarter, mortgage rates have come down, and if interest rates don't change, that could be a little bit of a boost to the housing market.
So you don't see that as a trend then?
No, not unless a major recession comes along, I wouldn't have thought.
Mortgage rates that are tied to a variable index, they're sensitive to rate increases by the Fed.
Yeah.
And a small change in those rates can make a big difference in the monthly payments of people who hold those types of mortgages. A lot of those mortgages have been put over the last 30 years. Have y'all got a metric or a measure of what the negative impact of the 1% increase in the Fed would do to those type of mortgages?
Yeah, we can work it out. A lot of people are on fixed rate mortgages. So and so they're not affected by changes in interest rates. So it's refinancing activity. There's a lot of refinancing activity in the past when interest rates were very low. Refinancing activity fell off recently when interest rates started to rise. Now that they've fallen again, my suspicion is we can see more refinancing activity out there. Mortgage lending standards they've begun to loosen a little bit. Mortgage lending standards for subprime, they really tightened after the Great Recession, and they haven't loosened very much. But for other parts of the population, they've loosened a fair bit. We're beginning to see some subprime mortgage securitization. So subprime disappeared for about 10 years, and now it's just about coming back in the market.
So you don't anticipate having leverage to debt for debentures from the big market causing all the bad credit?
Where do we see the risks to the economy? And you can see this, the Fed has started publishing what's called a financial stability report. The first one, I think, came out last month. And on the whole, we don't see house prices are overvalued in some cities. On the whole, we don't see them overvalued generally. However, if house prices continue rising at the rate they were rising, then there is a risk of overvaluation. But on the whole, we don't see it. It's specific to some particular cities.
And there's the financial stability report?
Yeah. Where we see the risks are in commercial real estate. I don't know whether you're used to the term cap rates. Yeah, okay. Cap rates are extremely low. cap rates for multifamily are extremely low. So we think there's overvaluation in commercial real estate. And the other area that's a major concern to us is, as I mentioned, corporate lending, because we think lending standards have declined a little bit. And there's different types. There's more lending in areas that are relatively new or areas that we think are riskier, and the risk is not necessarily priced in. And then the last area we would be a little bit concerned about is we've changed a lot of regulations, so there's at times we're seeing sort of shortages of liquidity in places. Some of that we think is due to changes in regulations. Banks have to hold more, they call it high quality liquid assets. So when they have to sort of report at the end of quarters, we see these sort of some problems in markets. And that may be an aspect of our regulation. It may be an aspect that the markets are changing a little bit. But the areas where, you know, the biggest risks we think are CRE and corporate. But you can read that. You can read the financial stability report yourself. It's in the public domain.
How is your committee, or the group that you're part of, regulating the banks? You mean to say like Citibank, they take all their loans. Is the bank auditors having to report for each loan over $1 million? You know, the loan amount, EBITDA, tangible assets that secure that. And then are you guys looking at that and having discussions with the lenders as to, hey, you want to get rid of that loan, that loan, that loan?
No, we don't directly tell a bank what to do. What we can do is say you haven't got enough capital, or we can give directions, advice, sort of guidance, saying there are risks building up in particular areas, and you should ideally reduce your concentration in those areas. What I do is completely independent. There's a Chinese wall between my work and a bank. I will never speak directly to a bank because I'm meant to be independent.
The reason I'm asking that is because our bankruptcy asset restructuring group is seeing certain lenders prune or trim their portfolios by pushing credits, borrowers out. And so somebody is getting to these banks, or they are being warned that, look, you need to start cleaning up, you know, some of your loans. So it is happening.
The bank examiners will go out and they look at so bank examiners are separate from the work I do.
Right.
They will go out and look at the individual loans in a bank's book, and they will say, have you rated that loan correctly? You might be rating it as a triple B loan, you know, using Moody's ratings or something like that. That's the borderline between sort of speculative and investment grade.
Is any of that information public?
The only information that's public is we have a program called the Shared National Credits. So it's for syndicated loans, really large loans that are shared out amongst 4 or 5 banks. And the examiners go out. They basically tell the banks they don't tell them too far in advance. We tell them a little bit in advance. We tell them we're going to go out and examine the quality of those loans, how you've rated them. So the rating matters. You could say this is a great loan, and it turns out to be an awful loan. And then that's going to erode the bank's capital and put the bank in a risky position if their ratings are wrong, because the banks are meant to hold capital against potential losses on loans. So if you give the wrong rating and you're too lenient, you're not holding enough capital, and the bank could default or be bought out by someone else, so create problems. So that shared national, the shared national credit report, there's a summary that's published. I think it just came out either in December or it came out very recently. And they've talked about a deterioration in credit quality. It's not a massive deterioration, but it is. So in that shared, I'll give you a minute. In that shared national credit, what they do is they go out and they, normally 2 examiners will look at loans. And these loans are held by 3 or 4 different banks. So you can examine how one bank is rating that loan and how another bank is rating that loan. And they will make the banks change their ratings if they feel they're wrong. The bank can dispute that, but ultimately it's a to and fro process, but very often they will make the bank change their rating. Because they will say you haven't got enough, maybe you haven't got enough, there isn't enough tangible assets underlying that loan, the sort of forecast of revenue looks unrealistic, things like that. So that could be an area where there would be a lot of feedback to the banks. Sorry.
To the gentleman's question, there is, if they are a publicly listed bank, within the FDIC, the mandate to evaluate their risk performance ratio, which categorizes loans at various classes against the potential risk and the Tier 1 capital requirements necessary to support those facilities. In addition to that, the Fed schedules, and most of the Fed players are not bankers, unfortunately, will also stress test the largesse of large components of both residential and commercial portfolios. The problem that I see is that the SOX requirements have been abated and have been, how should I say, diluted. So whereas in '07, like you said, the CMO bubble, that might have been a partial trigger to what happened, is still happening today, because the loans that are shared are public domain, and the only other method of ascertaining the answer to his question is to go to the Fed performance reports on a bank-by-bank basis. And the PBRS is quarterly. So likely the difficulty will occur within a 3-month period, and you won't know about it. That's a response to the gentleman's question as to, how this is determined.
I would just say one thing. We have regulated banks. That's the regular banking system. We've what's called shadow banking. It's largely banking that's unregulated. And for the regulated banks, their level of capital is dramatically higher than before 2007, before the Great Recession. So banks are holding almost twice as much capital. The big banks are holding almost twice as much capital as in 2007. And they complain bitterly about the level of regulation. And in part, that's why the shadow banking sector has grown. So some of our worry will be about the shadow banking sector because we don't regulate that. We don't set capital standards for that. But we can only deal with what we're allowed by law to deal with. And we're allowed by law to deal with the regulated banks. There's a sector out there that's unregulated. And we...
How can a bank be unregulated?
They're not taking deposits. So So generally. And there's other things, you know, Quicken Loans isn't a bank. It's providing a huge share of mortgages. You know, they're doing things that a lot of people would, you know, in the past you would have gone to your bank for a mortgage. Now you might go to Quicken Loans. Okay. Anyway, I better move away from bank regulation and talk about the economy. So, to keep the unemployment rate constant, we think we probably need about at normal times now, you'd need about 100,000 jobs per month. On average, you know, we said we're recovering from the Great Recession. So back in 2014, we're getting 250,000 jobs per month, 220, you know, 250,000, 200, 180. So before the tax cuts and everything else, I would have said those numbers would have come down last year. But the economy was on a sugar rush last year, and employment on average went up 220,000 jobs. So lots of jobs out there. Okay, you may complain about the quality of the jobs, but the labor market is booming. January was a little bit unusual. We don't know. You can see the numbers, 300,000 extra jobs in January. We don't know whether some of the people who are laid off, part-time laid off by the government, were working in second jobs or not. So it's a little distorted. We know in a few days what the numbers for February were. Yeah?
Well, we know that the unemployment rate has come down.
Sure.
Hasn't the underemployment rate also dropped?
Everything has come down. Yeah. Everything.
The quality of the jobs is better than it was previously?
Some people say, oh, we're creating more low quality jobs. The evidence doesn't support that. Yeah, so, you know, sort of minimum wage type jobs, but the evidence isn't what we actually find. You can see the unemployment rate is being on a downward trend. There's a green and a red line. These are what we think in the long run the unemployment rate would be. Abstracting from business cycles. One of this is what the Fed thinks in red. This is the Congressional Budget Office. We have an acronym for it. We call it the natural rate of unemployment, but just think of it as a normal level of unemployment over the long term. A normal level of unemployment would be maybe 4.6%. We're down at 4%. So the unemployment rate is very low. And what's been happening is we've been getting, particularly for prime age people, so 25 to 54, it doesn't include me. So prime age, if you'd ask what's the long-term trend for labor force participation, the US labor force is getting older. And so as you get older, the fewer people participate. They're actually working in or they're looking for a job. That's how we count participation. So given the age structure of the US population, it's getting a little bit older. The trend we would see in participation should be a smooth sort of downward trend like that. So these past few years, the flattening here for everyone, or the increase in the prime age participation rate, that's going against the trend. And that's telling you the labor market is so hot that people who previously wouldn't have worked in the labor force are moving back into the labor force. So we're drawing people back in. So you're seeing, you know, surveys, firms say they can't find the right people. And they're talking about either retraining, which is great, or sometimes offering, the last thing they seem to offer is, well, if you're short of workers, you know, pay a bit more. But that isn't always, in surveys, that isn't always the response they give. But we are seeing firms paying more. We are seeing firms offering more benefits to workers. We are seeing firms being more flexible. And a really nice outcome is we're seeing firms training their existing workers so that they're upping their skills. We don't have the greatest measures of wage growth. So back in 2007, wages were growing between 3 and 4%. Wage growth was flat for years until about 2014, 2015. and gradually they've started growing. So 3%, there's different surveys, 3% or so. This survey up here, the red one in red, this is tracking people who've, they're in the same job. So it's abstracting from people entering the labour force, because we think, as I told you, the labour force is getting older. So the people who are leaving the labour force are more experienced. They tend to be on higher wages. And the people who are coming in are often younger, or they're being out of the labour force for a long time. So you're replacing people on higher wages with people on lower wages. And that sort of holds down the growth rate. This measure here is trying to abstract from that fact. It's capturing people who've been working now and working last year. And you can see their wage growth is almost 4%. And this is an average, so. But this is pretty strong wage growth. We're getting back to where we were in 2007, 2006. But it's taken a very long time for that to happen. Part of it. Because there's a little bit, yeah. But this is observed wages, yeah. There's an element of that, but a lot of this isn't, the wage growth here isn't just changes in minimum wages. Because the effect of minimum wages on the overall figures, not that many people are at the minimum wage. So this is labour market pressure. You might ask, well, how come it isn't 5% or 6%? Wages are driven by two things, labour force productivity. Productivity isn't as strong as it was, say, 2 decades ago. Underlying labour force productivity is still pretty low. Hopefully some of the tax changes will encourage productivity, and there's some evidence that productivity is picking up. But productivity is the base. And then we think of labour market slack. Is the unemployment rate very low? When the unemployment rate is very low, wages will go up. When the unemployment rate is very high, there's no pressure on wages. So that's the cyclical aspect of it. What's the state of the labour market? Is there lots of wage pressure or little wage pressure? There's quite a bit of wage pressure now because it's hard to fill jobs. So that's why wages are rising. Why aren't these numbers, instead of 3 to 4%, why aren't they 5 to 6%? It's because the underlying level of productivity is lower than it was 2 decades ago. Inflation's close to 2%. We have a sort of esoteric way, or we concentrate on a particular measure of inflation in the Fed. It's called PCE inflation, personal consumer expenditure inflation. It's the way it's measured in the national accounts. It's a particular concept of consumer spending. So the inflation rate for consumers. And we tend to abstract from things that we know are very cyclical. So we talk about core inflation. We know energy prices go up and go down a lot. Food prices fluctuate a lot. So we try and strip out those two components because they're not telling you about future inflation. They're things that vary a lot and they revert over time quickly. So we look at core inflation, and the latest reading was around 1.9%, close to 2. We also have a measure called trend mean, and it takes out the really big changes at the top. We look at all these different, there's probably 100 categories of consumer expenditure. You strip out the ones where the prices went up the most, you strip out the ones where prices went up the least, because they're not very informative about future inflation, and you look at what's left. And these measures are close to 2%. So one of the mandates for when we set interest rates is, we want inflation. We've decided, the Fed has said our target is 2% inflation. And we're pretty much close to 2% inflation. Yeah, because it's a broader basket of goods that more reflects the actual spending, but people disagree about this. You know, if I ask you what your inflation rate is, it's not going to correspond to a CPI inflation rate, consumer price index inflation rate. It's not going to correspond to this because each of us have different spending patterns. These are average patterns. Or if I talk about the inflation rate for people who are retired, it's going to be very different from this, or the inflation rate for first-time homeowners. Again, people say, oh, this doesn't reflect my inflation, but it's our best measure of inflation for the population as a whole. Anyway, the Fed, we always had an implicit target of 2% inflation. Now we've got an explicit, we've said it. We want inflation to be close to 2%, and it is. And part of the reason it's 2%, the other issue we look at is inflation expectations. So we're not just interested in inflation today, but what people think inflation will be. And they being pretty stable around 2% for a long time. So what about consumer confidence? It's pretty, there's different measures of it. You can see it fluctuates a lot from month to month. These are two different surveys. One is the University of Michigan. They survey about, I think, 1,000 consumers. And they ask them, how do you feel about your current situation? How do you feel about your situation over the next year or not? And this is a combination of your current situation and over the next year. And they ask them, are you likely to buy a car? Are you likely to buy a house? Are you likely to purchase some big consumer goods in the next few years? And they're pretty good indicators, but they do fluctuate a lot. And they're not always you sort of take an average reading. These ones dipped recently, but they've recovered a little bit, and we're pretty sure that was to do with the government shutdown and all the negative news that was out there. So if I showed you the expectations components, they're more positive than the current situation. People think there's lots of jobs out there. They're on the whole fairly, reading through the month-to-month variation, on the whole they're fairly positive. What do you think about consumers' balance sheets? You know, the overall state of consumers' balance sheets. No, actually, the leverage is lower than, it's still pretty low. Yeah, on average. This is on average. Yeah,
and it was national debt, state debt, and
consumer debt has risen,
yeah,
but it's still relatively low.
and maybe they were thinking in an aggregate sense.
Yeah.
For instance, when they were talking about the 7 million individuals that are 90 days past due on their auto notes, which is
Yeah.
A new high for us. That's what, 2010, I think.
Okay. In terms of cars, autos, the lending changed, and they started lending to subprime borrowers. Yeah. So the composition of lending changed. You have more subprime, so you get more delinquencies. So if you choose to go down that route, inevitably you get more delinquencies, and that's what's showing up in the case of cars.
I guess what I have to remind myself when you're talking about these graphs is you're talking about
Average. Yeah. On the whole, consumer debt has gone up, but we sort of judge it by what's the ratio of debt to income, or what's the ratio of your repayments to your source of income. And there's no dramatic change there, because for a long time, the banks were very cautious about lending. Lending standards for mortgages and everything else tightened. They've loosened a little bit. In case of cars, they loosened quite a lot in case of cars. But overall, we're not seeing the freewheeling we saw back in 2006, 2007. So on the whole, consumers' debt levels aren't excessive. And then their housing wealth has gone up as the housing market, as economy as the housing market recovered. And then stock market wealth went up. Okay, we know the past, from September to December, January was a bad time. But if we look at, say, the S&P 500, in the past, since December, the S&P 500 has gone up 5%, and we're still only 5% below the peak of where we were in September. So the S&P 500 is basically roughly where it was back in July 2018. So we saw a little, if you'd asked me, I would have said corporate equity markets were overvalued. Some of the readjustment in prices was, getting closer to proper valuations. So we saw a lot of variation. Prices rose a lot. They peaked in September. You got a lot of market uncertainty. They fell a lot, particularly in December, and they've come back up quite a long way. In terms of consumers, many consumers are insulated from that day-to-day movements because their wealth is actually in pensions and things like that. And most of their wealth is, for the average consumer, most of their wealth is housing. So when you ask us about the effect of different components of wealth and consumer spending, we don't find a huge impact from stock prices on consumer spending. We find a bigger impact from housing. So we say, what's the marginal propensity to consume? If your stock market wealth goes up by 100 on average, how much more spending does that lead to? It's $1. So your MPC, the extent to which you spend when the average consumer spends when the stock market goes up by $100 is $1. If your housing wealth went up by $100, we would say you'd spend $2 to $2.50. So because for most people, housing wealth is more important than stock market wealth. That fell after the Great Recession. The extent to which you could withdraw equity from your house, that fell to about $1.50. It peaked before the Great Recession. It peaked at between 3% and 4%. You're able to withdraw equity by refinancing or cash out refis. That was it was very big, and you could, if house price went up by 100%. On average, people spend $3 to $4 more for the average consumer. That's come down as access to credit changed. It reached a low of around 1.5%, and now it's back up to around 2.5%. It's one of the things we try and monitor. Okay. You probably heard about this, really low retail sales in December. They came in much lower, but actually, this is one of the series. This initial number, as I said, this is a number that will probably get revised 5 or 6 times. And the eventual number may be a little, the dip may be half the size of what's showing here. So we don't read too much into this, because if you look at reports from a lot of shops and so on, December wasn't too bad for them. So this number is at odds with other information we have, softer information we have. And then, as you know, the housing market has been sluggish. This is sales and permits for single-family houses. So affordability was kicking in, higher interest rates were kicking in, the market became sluggish. Now, house prices are they're not growing at the same rate. Incomes are growing a little faster. Mortgage rates have come down, so we might see a little pickup in activity here. And then what about foreign economies? Overall, when we talk about all the advanced economies, Canada, Japan, the UK, Europe, Korea, all of those advanced economies, the US is top of the pack. We're the outlook for the US is better than the outlook in almost all those other economies. In Europe, there's problems in the UK with Brexit. There's problems in Italy. There's problems in France. There's problems in Germany. The problems in Germany may be short term, because there's a problem with the emissions. A lot of the companies were fooling with the emission standards on their cars, and that's affected industrial car production and overall industrial production. So Germany may bounce back. But what these measures are, they're the outlook for the sort of indicators of what senior executives say about the short-term 6 to 8 month outlook for their companies. And you can see they're turning down. So advanced economies, developed markets, emerging markets here. This is largely China and so on. Okay, this is manufacturing. So it's a little bit more gloomy. Overall, 2018 growth in these economies was marked down quite a bit, particularly in Europe and in China. 2019 growth is low, but it hasn't been. We anticipated it would be low. It's not that the outlook has changed dramatically. So we're seeing the support you might have got from economies growing strongly abroad isn't there. The economies abroad are growing at a fairly weak rate, but we're not seeing recession. We're just seeing slow growth abroad. What about measures of financial stress? So, we can talk about the common measures you might look at are the VIX, which is the volatility associated with options and stock prices. Or the other measures might be some various measure of bond spreads. So this is junk bonds or speculative bonds. They're the bonds just below the BBB rating. And the spread according to relative to 10-year treasuries. Okay, they spiked. They spiked before. It's, doesn't particularly get me excited. We've seen this before. There's just a little bit of fear in the market, a little bit of bearishness. It's nothing like what happened here. Okay, if they were to spike, it could have a dramatic effect on corporate defaults. But the levels we're seeing at the moment, I could show you the VIX as well. So some people will show you a chart like this. This is just what's happened in the past 18 months. And you think, oh, this is awful, But you really have to take a longer perspective. Yes, they've risen, they've come back down a bit, but the spike was nothing like the spikes we've seen in the past. Nothing like the spike during the Great Recession. Nothing like the spike during the dot-com bubble. The dot-com bubble and so on, in other recessions like this. If I showed you the VIX is elevated, but again, it's not way out there in a range that you'd be extremely worried about. Okay. This is, the Fed controls monetary policy. We don't control fiscal policy. We have no control over spending or taxes. The only thing we control is monetary policy, and we regulate some parts of the financial system. We've got a dual mandate, and the wording is a little funny. Maximum employment. So employment, we normally think of it as the employment rate that's close to the natural rate of unemployment, what we think is the long-term level of unemployment. We're above that rate. The economy is hot. We're actually, the unemployment rate is lower than we think is a normal rate. So the economy is hot. Price stability, 2% inflation. We've got 2% inflation. And normally you'd say, well, we've achieved our objectives and maybe the economies are running a little bit hot. So normally you'd say you'd raise interest rates to get rid of some of that heat in the economy, to get back to a more normal, a gradual raise in rates. And that's what we've been doing. So last year we raised rates by 25 basis points 4 times, so a quarter of a percentage point. Overall, 1 percentage point over the year. The expectation was we would keep doing that. There was considerable market turmoil in December, and I should really, given your comments, I should have added the other reasons why we paused, like uncertainty about the growth prospects and so on. The fear of slowdown, a global slowdown, all of those factors. So up until December, we'd always used these words. We will see some further gradual increase in Fed funds rate, the Fed's funds rate, the rate of interest we control. We said that's being in our statements, which we issue after it's 8 meetings a year. After each meeting, they issue a statement. And the word, people parse the wording to see exactly what it means. And this particular set of words means, interest rates are likely to rise over the next, year or so. We dropped that statement in January. Earlier in the year, we had a statement, monetary policy is likely to remain accommodative, because we thought we're far away from our target. We dropped that statement earlier in the year because we thought we're approaching our target. Now we've dropped the statement, and then there's been various speeches, and the clarification has been that we're pausing and we're monitoring what's happening, and then we will consider what we do going forward. But as I said, the market has interpreted this as the likelihood of further rises being very low. And some people talk about interest rates falling, but okay. And then what are the longer term challenges? Because I think the short term, like for the Fed, obviously there's lots of challenges. We've got a large balance sheet. We have to reduce the balance sheet. We're trying to ensure that with the uncertainty about the global economy, we keep the US economy on a good track. But there's a lot of other things happening out there. So overall, we think the risk now is a little bit riskier than in the past. So there's all that turmoil, or there was turmoil in markets. So we know markets they can change very rapidly. So whatever we do, we have to do it carefully. Okay. Try not to suddenly change course and upset markets too much. Try and give markets a good indication of what we're doing in advance. So they say monetary policy should be boring, because people are aware of what you're doing, and when you change rates, they anticipate that change in rates. So you don't shock the markets, one concern. But, why have the risks risen? We've ongoing trade disputes. We've risks from a slower global growth. I think the risks were greater last year than they are this year. There's the possibility of a recession in China. Now, the Chinese economy is not a real market economy. So the Chinese authorities can do a lot more than we can do. They can direct people to invest or do things, but a lot of what they've done in the past has been investment in things that are not very productive. So you have a lot of new buildings, highways, etc. That, highways to nowhere. So sometimes the policies they've adopted haven't, like the short term, they boost the economy, but they're not increasing the productive potential of the economy. But in China, they can do a lot, so a lot more than we can do. They can dictate what happens to the economy in many cases. Believe it or not, there's a lot of concern about that. So
Obviously that is falsifying the data and padding the numbers for decades now.
well, I'll tell you about some research that people have done. You may have heard about it. You can measure, using satellite images, you can measure the light and energy that's being used. And actually, when you track that over time, it's pretty close to the numbers the Chinese are putting out. So they smooth their data, definitely. But overall, there's nothing to indicate that they're way off. But people disagree, but I was sort of surprised by that. My prior was that they were manipulating their numbers a little bit, but as far as we can tell, there's uncertainty about this, but the numbers they are coming out with are we think are roughly correct.
So does that mean they're lighting buildings that don't have anyone?
There's other things, yeah. No, we know things are slowing in China. They're slow, but as far as we can tell, when they say they've 6% growth, that's probably what they have.
What was the growth again?
6%. Yeah, but real. It was 9-10% a few years ago, so people talk about it slowing, but 6% is pretty good still. Yeah.
With the markets, with technology affecting the stock market today and all the algorithmic trading, are you more sensitive on your wording? Because you know the changing direction, you said changing direction really spooks the market. Does that amplify it in your view?
Oh yeah, a huge, well, there's certain words mean certain things. So there's people whose full-time job it is to interpret Fed statements. So they're employed by financial firms, and basically they're monitoring speeches and statements, of formal statements and speeches, and the exact words you use are very, very important. And we in the New York desk, who do a lot of the markets work for the system as a whole, they will go out and poll market makers, find out what their opinions are. When I get, I can get something daily, but they basically every day they will speak to contacts in the market, and you will hear what the market reaction is to various pieces of news and so on. And we know, I can tell you, we know when our communication is bad. You know, if we misspeak, if the chairman misspeaks or someone speaks out of turn, you're very aware of it. So we're trying to minimize those occasions.
Do you think the algorithm should it possibly trigger it?
There's concerns.
Economy, because there's so much tension tied up in the market?
Well, short term, yeah, the market can overreact, and that algorithmic trading can make things a lot worse. So if it's severe, we haven't tested it. There's been various occasions where we think those algorithmic tradings have led to short-term, massive short-term volatility in markets. Well, what I would say is we don't know for sure. When the next recession happens, we will know. Oh yeah.
And the other question I got is on balance of trade, China. If we had a neutral balance of trade, what would that do to our GDP versus their GDP?
We're a net importer. Well, other things would change inevitably. So, you know, if you're not buying stuff from China, you buy it from a lot of it, you probably buy from someplace else. Or you'd make it here. So consumers would pay more. Presume, prices would go up.
But just on GDP,
I think the numbers I've seen, and it's very hard to come out with a short-term number. The long-term numbers are quite small. The effect of the tariff wars, or if all the tariffs come in, they'd knock about, say the economy is growing at 2.5%, it would knock that down to about knock it down to 2.4 or 2.3. Decline. It could be, yeah. Because we're buying from China because it's cheaper. We end up either producing it more expensively here, and or but people will react to higher prices as well.
Also, there's less consumption, you're saying.
Yeah, yeah,
It would affect the consumption component of it.
yeah, yeah.
So as far as the tariffs go, and others might have a different opinion, I was of the mind that was more about currency warfare than it was about trade warfare.
The real issue is not on the hard goods. The real issue is intellectual property. So the real issue is whether the Chinese are, well, we know that Chinese are stealing intellectual property. So that's the major issue there. But, you know, some of the changes in tariffs probably need to be changed, but just the way, my opinion is the way you do it is a more diplomatic way of doing it, which less disruptive way of doing it. But there are issues with China that, in terms of trade, that do need to be sorted out. Whether this was the most effective way of doing it, I'm not sure.
I just don't, you know, the Chinese have been very good at outmaneuvering us and many others, so take the kid gloves off, in my opinion.
Yeah, but yeah, some people say that. I guess a collective, as opposed to doing things unilaterally, a multilateral approach to China would have been better. So if more countries went down this route.
I'd love them to join us.
Anyway, I'm not meant to talk about trade. Forget everything I said.
Oil is very crucial to Texas.
Okay, yeah.
And oil pricing has been impacted by improved technology and ability,
Yeah.
lower cost of oil production for breaking, but also Russia's desire to have this crude oil versus Saudi Arabia trying to keep its market share and the price driving
Yeah.
here, plus our surge in surplus.
Yeah, now we're net
How
exporting.
does that calculate some of these figures that we're seeing?
How many of you are from Texas? Okay, some of you. For Texas, oil is a big net positive. So when oil, the sort of the prospects for Texas are that the economy will grow not as fast as in the past, a little bit like what you said. Oil is around 57 at the moment. It fell. It was much lower, than that before. In terms of where we would see a real inflection point that would affect growth for Texas would be oil below 50. But for the vast majority of producers, the numbers we're seeing are well above break-evens. The problem is there's more competition now, so costs have gone up in a lot of cases. Oil well servicing and delivery costs have gone up. So investors are looking for more of a return on their profit. They realize it's more risky, so they're expecting a greater return. But we still think at $57 a barrel, it's okay. It's not going to have an adverse effect on Texas. Oil for the U.S. economy, at one stage, an increase in price of oil would have been a big negative for the U.S. Now it's a small negative for the U.S. because we're not as dependent on oil and we produce more of it domestically. So it's an input. Lower oil price are an input into other industries. It makes their cost lower, and it means they expand their output. So lower oil price are good for many industries. They're good for consumers. But on net, for the U.S. as a whole, higher oil prices are a negative, lower oil prices are a positive. Whereas it's switched for Texas. We like higher oil prices here, and we dislike lower oil prices.
I talked to some producers, and their break-even has moved from the mid-50s down to the mid-40s.
Yeah.
And so long as they
course. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I didn't bring a slide along, but if you look at the uncertainty around those, people produce forecasts of oil prices. And the current forecasts are roughly, you know, this sort of 55 to 60 over the next 18 months. But I'm not sure whether you use the terminology, it's sort of 95% confidence interval, like 2 standard deviations, 2 levels of variation up or down. It's roughly 100 down to 20. So there's massive uncertainty out there. So, you know, you take these things with a grain of salt. And the problem is it's not... Yeah, that's right. And the problem with the oil market is a lot of the decisions are geopolitical. They're not economic. It's not to do with supply and demand. It's a decision about OPEC wanting to boost their revenue or Russia wanting to get around sanctions, get around the problems with sanctions and so on.
One of the things that I just wanted to get some clarity on, you said that the U.S. is less dependent on oil. Are you meaning less dependent on foreign oil?
Yeah, yeah. Well, we're less dependent on oil, full stop.
Okay, so
Our cars, our use of energy is way more efficient. Yeah.
So would you say that's technology driven at this point?
In the past, it was cost driven, and yeah, combination technology and costs. Because oil was expensive, you invested in technology that enabled you to use less of it. Okay. So the long-term challenges, they're nothing to do with monetary policy, but they are a little bit to do with fiscal policy. But one is low productivity growth. So as I told you, productivity growth fell. It fell, we think it fell from about 2003 onwards. It came down quite a bit. And there's dispute about that. But this is sort of common. It wasn't just the US, it was across for all advanced economies. And then we have our own grown issue, which is the fiscal deficit. And, you know, all we're going to do is add to debt. It's not a worry now. We can, you know, the US is perceived to be a good, in terms of people funding the debt, the US is perceived to be a good...
So when will there be a year of accountability?
15 to probably 10 to 15 years from now, judging by other countries. But the US is, you know, when global investors get really scared, which economies do they invest in? The US, Switzerland, and Japan. So we're okay for the moment, as long as we have sensible policies. So in terms of the deficit can grow, it's a concern that it's growing. Is it a major concern now? No, it isn't. But you are concerned about the trajectory. What's the path? If it keeps on the same path, then it will become an issue eventually. So how do we deal with low productivity? We talk about supply side policies. So policies to boost competition, policies to invest in skills, all of that stuff. And then what about the fiscal deficit? Well, that's an issue for politicians. Politicians like kicking difficult problems down the road. So there's a reluctance to tackle these issues because inevitably hard choices have to be made. The easier, you know, if we knew the answers to boosting higher productivity, that could be make the economy grow a bit faster. So your numerator, when we talk about the debt to GDP ratio, your numerator is the level of debt. Your denominator is the size of the economy. So let's get over the problem maybe a little bit by cutting the numerator, you know, getting our finances in order. But let's get over the problem really by growing the economy faster. And I skip just. What do we know about productivity? Okay. It's the most important component of long-run growth and living standards. And this sort of, we have a term for this sort of efficiency. So we've capital and labor and inputs. We put them together. How efficiently do we put them together? Could we, using the same inputs, could we get more out using those inputs? And we call that total factor productivity. Or it could be, in some cases, you know, we don't produce cheap clothing a lot in the US anymore because it's not where our value added is. In terms of a lot of industrial products, we're producing high value added products. The cheap, really cheap products are produced abroad. So one part of efficiency is moving up the value chain. Or, you know, just organizing things better. Someone comes in and figures out there's a better way of organizing things. So that's what we mean by total factor productivity. And there's nothing monetary policy or short-term tax breaks or, you know, refunds or anything like that will do. That's not these, we call them demand-side policies. They have nothing to do with productivity. It's all about supply-side policies, longer-term policies to boost growth. And there's dispute about it, but the research suggests that, you know, what we have is a big gap between the frontier firms and the firms that are below that. And frontier firms are amazingly efficient, and a lot of firms are lagging behind the frontier firms. We talk about, you may have heard the expression creative destruction. You know, some new technology comes along, horse-drawn carriages are replaced by cars. All of those things. So the economy is always changing. There's new startups. The startups challenges the established firms. The old established firms lose out. The new startups become the established firms, and then someone else comes along barking at their heels, and they're the new challenger. So we talk about creative destruction. Firms are always being, new firms are being created, old firms are sort of waning and dying out. And the evidence is we're seeing less of that now than in the past, despite what you may hear about, you know, all the new tech companies. When you look across the economy as a whole, there isn't as much creative destruction as 10 or 15 years ago. So it appears to be some sort of declining business dynamism is the main factor. So what people have said, we should try and come up with policies that boost new technologies and best practices. And I always thought, you know, when you ask which is the most competitive economy, I always think of the US until I started living here. And then there's a lot of strange anti-competitive policies here. You know, if you live in Dallas, you can have 2 TV providers, cable TV providers. You know, I lived in the UK before I came here, and there's, you know, 50 to choose from. There's no restrictions, and prices were low. You know, I didn't pay $200 for my cable or anything like that. So in some industries, I'm always a little bit surprised by the level, how little competition there can be in some areas. So we should simplify and rationalize economic regulation. And that sometimes we confuse simplifying and rationalizing regulation with giving breaks for certain companies. It's not giving breaks, it's creating more of a level playing field that makes innovation and growth simpler. Patents, we think there's a huge balancing act. You know, if you want to, you have to encourage people to put the money into research and development, you know, possible failures. So there's a sort of trade-off between how much protection you provide and how much you favor the consumer. At the moment, we think there's a little bit too little competition, too much protection in some patents, and there's too much rent seeking. People are going out and putting in patents that, you know, effectively are trying to prevent other people innovating, as opposed to being productive patents. There's licensing restrictions that are necessary. They're a barrier to entry. Healthcare suffers from a lack of competition. you know, a lot of workers' skills. In the US, we don't invest as much as we should in the skills of workers. It would be nice to see more firms invest more. That's part of a problem. We don't have an apprenticeship system in the US, and there's always the risk of, you know, you invest in someone, they will be poached. You know, that's a risk. In other countries, they've had apprenticeship systems for much longer, and poaching is less of a feature. But these are the sort of things we're talking about: supply side policies, infrastructure. We know in a lot of areas infrastructure is pretty poor. We've seen some tax reform, but I'm not sure it's been a lot of the corporate tax reform has led to mergers and acquisitions, and it's led to buybacks of shares and so on. It hasn't led to as much productive investment as we would like. So maybe the tax reform legislation wasn't properly designed. We could have designed it differently to get more investment in productivity. We have seen investment in productivity, but not as much as we would have liked. Immigration reform, there's a lot of immigration in the US. The laws changed from being skill-based to being family-based. And that happened around the 70s. So it became much harder to immigrate to the US on the base of skill than on the base of family connections. So we should move back more to a skill-based policy. So countries like Canada and Australia, if people have skills, they're highly skilled, particularly in areas that are in short demand, we should make it easier for them to immigrate to the US instead of making it harder. The key category for skilled immigration to the US at the moment is H-1Bs. H-1Bs have suddenly got amazingly hard. A process that would take, well, it takes a while anyway, because I went through that process, but now the sort of application and processing timelines, they've doubled. And the rate at which they're rejecting applications, I think, is doubled as well, which is not what we should want. You know, we want the economy to grow faster. In the past, the US has attracted the brightest and the best. And that's what it should be doing now as well. And surprisingly, in the past, we saw a lot of federal support for research and development. You know, all the things NASA and various other things did. The internet was developed using the US military and public support for research and development. A lot of the innovations that came about through NASA have fed into things we see on a day-to-day basis. So a lot of what would have been considered core, non-commercial, or, you know, research and development didn't have a short-term commercial focus, was carried out with public support, and that public support is being cut back. But, you know, the evidence suggests that we should fund more of that long-term core support, core research and development, and that it will pay off in the long term. A lot of this technology, you can't say it will pay off for sure in 2 years or 5 years or 10 years, but the evidence is it certainly pays off in the long term. It's like a public good. But we've cut back on that. We haven't invested in infrastructure. We've had some tax reform, but it hasn't been as efficient as it should be. And we haven't really seen immigration reform. We've seen tighter controls on immigration as opposed to immigration reform. So these are things we could probably do that might boost productivity. Some of these other things as well, parts of these things have been looked at, but very often special interests intervene, and we don't really get as much done as we would like. Okay, so that's it.
I've got a comment.
Yeah.
This is the fastest 90-minute economic discussion I've had. It was fascinating. I'm one grateful.
Thank you.
But I hope when you're visiting with local and state governments and Congress that you tell them to turn their phones off and pay attention, because I don't think they are. Because, you know, experts like you come in, you make these presentations that make sense,
And I don't think our government officials are, I think they're asleep at the wheel.
Okay. Thank you.